Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series, Can We Save the Oakland A's? And we are at the midway point of this 2041 season. Things are going pretty well for the Oakland A's on the field at 49 and 33. We've got an 8-game lead in the AL West, and we've got the best record in the American League as we try to position the team to repeat as World Series champions this October. That being said, has not been a perfect path to the playoffs for the A's this season. Our number one starter, Jesus Saldana, out for the year with a torn UCL, and he'll likely miss the first few months of next season as well. And Ernesto Comunez, who had been an important starter for us this year as well, also out for the rest of the year with a torn labrum. So two key starting pitchers out for the season, just months after we moved away from Mike Gallick and Chase Dora, who were more expensive veteran starters on our team. So we've definitely had to scramble a little bit to keep the rotation working well here in 2041. But as we sit here on July 5th, as I mentioned, best record in the AL, and we're second in the American League in runs allowed. And even with those injuries, our starters' ERA is the best in the AL. So things could certainly be worse. Hopefully the offense will pick up over the coming weeks as we head closer to the trade deadline and then into August and September after that. This will likely be a relatively short episode. Going to sim ahead less than a week to the first-year player draft, and then as we usually do, we'll request help from anyone in the worldwide scouting department who has thoughts on our options available with our first-round draft pick. Before we get to the draft, I'm going to have 3 games at home against the Twins and then a couple at home against Seattle before going on the road on draft day to Kansas City, Baltimore, and then Toronto before the All-Star break here in 2041. Given that we had an excellent record last year, 106 wins was the best record in baseball, and we also won the World Series. We will be picking last, 36th in the first round. However, due to those departures that I alluded to earlier of Chase Dora and then Jake Ortega, our longtime center fielder, we will have a couple of supplemental picks, number 42 and 43 overall in the first round. So although 35 players will be off the board before we finally get to make a selection, we will then have 3 of the next 8 picks. So definitely could use some thoughts on strategy for the players who ultimately will be on the board for us. I'd say at a high level, not the deepest draft. You look at the highest potential pitchers, and there's basically a dozen or so who seem like they could potentially be impact players at the major league level. The pool of batters is a little deeper, but not a lot of 4.5 to 5-star prospects this year. Our hope is we'll find a few gems in the rough with whoever's on the board in the late 30s and early 40s when we're making our next picks and our first picks in this upcoming draft. And we finished off the homestand well, won 4 of the 5 games that we were talking about against Minnesota and Seattle, as we talked about in the last episode. That win in the final game of the first series in the month of July against the Rockies ended a shocking 6-game losing streak for our Oakland A's. So feeling a bit better about things, having now won 5 of our last 6 as we head into the draft. That being said, fan interest continues to deteriorate bit by bit, despite the fact that as we sit here on July 11th, we've expanded the lead in the AL West to 9 games, and we are now up 2 games on the White Sox for the best record in the American League. And we're not really expecting most of these big-time players, or more accurately, potential big-time players who are right now big-time prospects, to be on the board when we are selecting with our first pick at number 36. But let's take a look at who's going to be available. We'll auto-draft until our pick. And now it's time to take a look at some of the top prospects available for us. And as I mentioned, as we do sit here now with the 36th pick in the draft, 3 of the next 8 picks are going to be ours in Oakland. Hopefully this will give us an opportunity to really replenish our farm system by the compensatory picks that we got for the departures of Dora and Ortega. So since we're going to have a relatively short episode here focused almost entirely on the draft, we'll probably look at a few more players then also, and what I will do before the episode finishes is we'll also check in on where some of those players are expected to go in the draft, at least in the mock draft, as we know that doesn't always work out perfectly, but it could give us an idea of initial thoughts on a strategy to hopefully maximize who we can bring on board. Reliever Gordy Wango is an 18-year-old right-handed pitcher committed to Michigan State. Like the high work ethic and intelligence, 18-year-old sidearmer who throws in the mid to high 90s. Outstanding fastball and potentially an excellent cutter as well, working on his sinker. Control and movement, nothing exceptional, but has plenty of stuff. Don't really know that Porker Wargo would be someone we'd take this early, but there's probably a time and a place for him. One of the more developed at this point prospects is a college reliever, Caleb Thompson, out of Michigan. I think his stuff and his movement could both be above average. The issue is his potential control. Ultimately could have a nice combination of an above-average fastball with an above-average slider. Another side armor, throws in the low to mid-90s. Don't see him as a real high-end prospect. Think he could be a useful middle reliever if all goes well for Ape Thompson. Starting pitching prospect, high schooler B.J. Keene, committed to FIU. High adaptability and work ethic. We think his stuff, his movement and control could all be average to slightly above. Do like that BJ has a potential 5-pitch arsenal if everything goes well. Pretty solid stamina and good at holding on runners. And the last of the 3-star ceiling prospects is another college player, but a starter, Zach Davis out of the University of West Alabama. Only a 3-pitch arsenal, and outside of the changeup, don't really think that any of those pitches are going to be materially above average. Decent stamina, not the best at holding on runners. Almost 22 years old, and he's just barely touching 90 on the radar gun. So his stuff, not particularly impressive, but think his movement could be a bit above average and could potentially have outstanding control if all worked out for him. Before we get into the higher ceiling pitching prospects, there is one other college prospect I want to talk about. That's Jeff Benefield, 21-year-old out of NC State. He's definitely a reliever type, already has an above-average fastball and a slightly above-average changeup. Not a ton of stamina, but think his stuff, his movement and control could all be a bit above average to well above average if things work out. Throws in the low 90s. I think he could be a very solid bullpen arm, not necessarily someone that has a incredibly high ceiling, as you can see from the star ratings. And as some of you have noted, I tend to use the star ratings to just keep a small amount of the fog of war on, but I am considering maybe with OOTP 26 move into the numerical rating, so you can see even more depth as you're watching on some of these things. I don't really have a strong opinion either way. But I know some of you play with the numbers rather than the stars, so that's something I'm thinking about, but still a few months away from needing to make a decision on that. El Diablo, not a guy that I think I would take with our first pick, but if he's still on the board a little bit later, and I don't have any reason to suspect he won't be in the supplemental picks, could be somebody to think about. There's 4 pitchers that we, at least our scout, I think has slightly higher ceilings than the others that we've talked about. Chris Sobolewski, a 18-year-old starter. Don't love the low adaptability and work ethic, but he is an 18-year-old who's already throwing in the mid-90s. Potential for a 4-pitch arsenal if all works out well, but it's not inconceivable that things don't work out that well, and he's kind of a guy with 2 major league pitches when all is said and done. I think his stuff, his movement and control could all be a bit above average in a perfect scenario for his development. Not great at holding on the runners, average stamina. Given that best case scenario we think is that he's a bit above average in everything, and his low work ethic in particular, and perhaps the low adaptability may influence his ability to ultimately reach his true potential. Don't know that I'm enthusiastic about taking him right here at number 36. Mike Mercer, 18-year-old left-handed closer. Not a ton of stamina, but he does potentially have a 3-pitch arsenal if that sinker and cutter both develop. So if you got lucky with those pitches developing, and maybe lucky in the development lab with some stamina, could probably turn him into a 5-inning starter in a best-case scenario. I think his stuff and his control could both be well above average. Average movement on his pitches. As we mentioned, he's a southpaw. High loyalty, adaptability, and work ethic, throwing in the mid to high 90s already. Bones Mercer, certainly an interesting prospect, but unless I had a lot of confidence we were going to turn him into a starter, it's a little bit of a reach here as far as I'm concerned. The impossible to sign Hans Felix Bates. High work ethic and intelligence, really good stamina, outstanding at holding on runners, barely touches 90 on the radar gun. I think he could have a 5-pitch arsenal, but we don't expect any of those pitches to really be above average major league pitches. Think that his stuff overall will be well below average for a major leaguer. Good movement and good control on his pitches if he reaches his full potential, but he's already committed to UAB, and he's likely to be looking for a ton of money to sign. So I think HF Bates is probably not the direction we would go. Last, Mike Ball. He's kind of the opposite. Very easy to sign, looking for a bonus that is well below slot at this point. Really good stamina, okay at holding on runners. Potential 3-pitch arsenal if that changeup develops. Think they can all be a bit above average. So think his stuff, his movement and control could all be average to slightly above at the major league level. Honestly, can't say that I'm necessarily in love with any of these pitchers, but we'll have a better sense of if any of them should be on our radar over the next 8 picks after we take a look at some of the top position players who are available. And I mentioned before looking at the mock draft that I didn't necessarily feel all that excited about any of these pitching prospects that we saw. And looking at the mock draft, that does reinforce it to me. One guy that we talked about, Hans Felix Bates, expected to go with the 13th pick in the 3rd round. But otherwise, none of the other pitchers that we talked about were projected to go in the top 5 rounds. Now, you could say that means that I can be very patient and perhaps load up on a bunch of pretty good value pitchers in the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th rounds. But honestly, when I look at this mock draft, there's just very few pitchers picked, period. I mean, you look down here into the 5th round of this draft, and There's Pat Letary, Billy Swain, who are both starting pitching prospects, are the only pitchers picked. So there's 2 pitchers picked among 30 picks in the fifth round of this mock draft. And it's not that dissimilar a story when we look at the 4th round, where we see that Randy Harris, a starting pitching prospect, Mike Young, a starting pitching prospect, and then Mike DeCosmo, a starting pitching prospect. Only 3 of the 29 players estimated to go in the 4th round are pitchers as well. So for whatever reason, and you can even kind of see it with just a quick look here in the 3rd round, it's a similar situation where for whatever reason this mock draft has about 90% of the players coming off of the board being position players. I get the point that this draft may be a bit weighted in terms of the quality of the position players, but I have a hard time believing when all is said and done that only 10% of the players who come off the board in the next 150 picks are going to ultimately be pitchers. So while I don't think there's any need to rush the card up to pick any of these pitching prospects in our next 3 picks, our original first rounder and the 2 supplemental first rounders, if there are guys that we like as this draft moves along, I think regardless of what this mock draft tells us, picking some of these guys that we've talked about in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round may end up being what we have to do if we actually want to have them on the team when all is said and done. And before we get into the higher ceiling prospects in this draft, as far as the position players, we'll take a look at the guy with the highest floor. That's the shortstop Juan Monsives, a 22-year-old out of UC Santa Barbara. Looks like a potentially outstanding defensive player, Gold Glove caliber at any position that he could be playing in the infield. The issue with him is that his bat does not look, particularly at the age of 22, as it will ever be anything close to major league quality. I guess if he fully developed and reached every bit of potential that we think he had, he could be a interesting shortstop and certainly a very interesting utility infielder. But if he doesn't reach his full potential with the bat, there's probably not a ton to do with Mr. Monsives, despite his outstanding glove. Certainly not a guy that I would pick in one of these early picks. Similar to some of the pitchers we've talked about, if he's sitting on the board in the 3rd, 4th round, might be worth a flyer at that point, depending on who else is on the board. And position player-wise, there's about a dozen 3.5-star or higher prospects, all high school players, so those are the ones that we'll talk about now. Second baseman Butch Taylor, left-handed hitting middle infielder. Looks like he's borderline competent defensively, pretty average speed. Think if it fully develops, his bat could be a bit above average, potentially interesting home run power, and a little bit above average in terms of his contact. Looking for $2.2 million. El Professor, not the greatest prospect in the world, but someone we'd consider in a couple of rounds, perhaps. Center fielder Lou Powers, a pretty well-balanced bat. I think he could have above average home run power and eye if all goes well. Another guy with pretty average speed. Not that great defensively, average range, but a rag arm, and not all that great in terms of actually being able to hold on to the ball on those occasions that he gets to it. Is a left-handed hitter with some pop, though, not looking for a ton of money. Catcher Ben Luttrell, a little older, 19-year-old out of Dennis, Massachusetts. I think that might be on Cape Cod. If not, I think it's close to that area. Not that I'm an expert on the geography of Massachusetts. Another guy who we think the power and the eye could both be above average. Not a ton of speed and a pretty average defensive catcher at this point. That being said, a catcher who's competent defensively with a good eye and home run power could be an interesting player to consider as the draft moves along. Shortstop, Luis Humberto Ayala out of Chula Vista, California. Like his speed, competent defensively, high adaptability, and one of the more interesting bats we've seen thus far. Has got a lot of work to do on his contact, but ultimately we think his contact and his home run power could both be above average with outstanding gap power, coupled with the line drive tendencies and that pretty good speed. Could certainly knock a lot of extra base hits, and looks like ultimately he could be a competent defensive infielder. Second baseman, Chris Adams, 17-year-old out of King of Prussia, PA. Pretty well-balanced bat that we think could be a little bit above average in just about everything. Not the greatest speed, and he's got some work to do defensively. And the last of the 3.5-star potential prospects is a catcher out of Canada, Max Aastrom. Contact above average. I think his power and his eye could both be above average as well. Competent defensive catcher, not a ton of speed. Left-handed hitting catcher. Poor level of competition up against schools in Guelph, Ontario, and the surrounding area. So can't say that there's anyone I'm in love with from these first 6 position player prospects that we've talked through, but fortunately we think the ceilings of the next batch of 6 that we're going to be talking through are a bit higher. And of that batch of players that we just talked about, we, at least according to the OSA mock draft, are in the right area to be thinking about them. The shortstop, Luis Humberto Ayala, was projected to go 20th overall in this draft, so the fact that he's still on the board at 36 might be a bit of value for us. Similarly, the second baseman, Chris Adams, was expected to go 24th overall. So both Ayala and Adams are guys that we might want to think about taking relatively soon. Interestingly, a couple of other players are also expected to be off the board relatively soon. The catcher, Ben Luttrell, is expected to go with the 5th supplemental pick, just 6 picks from now. And last but certainly not least, the second baseman, Butch Taylor, is expected to go with the 6th supplemental pick, which would be the first pick of the supplemental draft for our Oakland A's and our 2nd overall pick. So definitely, compared to the pitchers, certainly some expectation that some of the guys that we've just talked about could be coming off the draft in the next several picks as we're either on the board or preparing to get back on the board. And I would expect that we're going to see something similar with the top 6 prospects that we're going to talk about right now. Ken Farmer is an 18-year-old shortstop prospect, pretty good infield range already, and high adaptability and work ethic. We think that the left-handed hitting shortstop could eventually have contact and home run power that are both significantly above average but not exceptional. Average speed, the gap power in the eye looking relatively average for a major leaguer if he fully develops. So interesting prospect for young Mr. Farmer. Not looking for a ton of money. Another infielder, third baseman, Mike Cady, left-handed hitting third baseman, Mr. Cady. Contact and home run power, both very interesting. Gap power and eye, much more average. Durable as far as his injury proneness, pretty slow on the base paths. Does have high adaptability. Can play a number of positions around the infield, but honestly, first base is probably the right spot for him. Does have a really good arm at third, but not the greatest at getting his glove on the ball and then being able to handle the ball properly on those occasions that he does get to it. So not a perfect prospect, but certainly another interesting guy to consider at this point. Another infielder, and then we'll finish off with three outfielders, is the shortstop Gabe Kimball. Pretty interesting profile here for the 18-year-old out of Sugar Land, Texas, committed to Oklahoma. They're not going to like that in Sugar Land, Texas. He is an above-average defensive infielder, we think, here at the age of 18. Pretty average in terms of his speed and a well-balanced batting profile. Best trait for him is his home run power, potentially. Worst trait is definitely his ability to draw walks. Don't know a ton about his personality quite yet. And the final three prospects we'll talk about, Esav Ben Menahem, a corner outfielder with the lovely nickname of Booger. Below average corner outfielder defensively, very poor speed and bunting ability. But there are some positive things for Ben Menahem: high adaptability and work ethic and low financial ambition. And most importantly, one of the more interesting bats that we've seen, the right-handed hitting outfielder could have potentially very good home run power with above average contact. Perhaps his eye gets a little bit above average and average gap power when all is said and done, although again does not have much speed to take advantage of those hits to the gap. And then finally, the two highest ceiling prospects in the draft, although it looks like both of them have at least one negative personality trait associated with them. Center fielder Juan Villa, low adaptability, really more of a corner outfield profile at 6'3". He could also play first base if we needed him to, but certainly one of the more interesting bats that we've seen, potentially above average in everything with 70 contact and 65 home run power if he reached his full potential. Only a fair level of competition for him in Puerto Rico, where he's been playing, committed to the College of Charleston. Does have slightly above average speed, although his instincts on the base paths are not particularly good at this point. And last, but hopefully not least, left fielder Eric Norcross, another corner outfield type, not particularly good defensively, also not particularly good in terms of his bunting and his base running. Low leadership, high adaptability, older for a high school prospect. He's going to be turning 19 in less than a month, but a pretty well-balanced hitting profile. Think his contact, gap power, and home run power could all be above average to well above average, coupled with an average eye. So certainly some interesting prospects for us to consider with 3 of the next 8 picks. To me, it doesn't seem like there is a absolute pound-the-table player that I'm in love with, but there will probably be someone that I prefer compared to all of the others by the time I get to make this decision 24 hours or so from now, and hopefully the worldwide scouting department will help guide me to a wise decision. And interestingly, none of these players that our scout thinks have higher ceilings were expected to have been off of the board quite yet. Actually, that's not true. Juan Villa was expected to have gone with the 35th pick right before this one, and the third baseman Mike Cady is who is projected to come to us with the 36th pick. In the second round, Gabe Kimball projected to go 10th in the second round. Eric Norcross projected to go 13th in the second round. And Ben Menahem expected to go 24th in the second round. Interestingly, Ken Farmer, can't find him in the top 5 rounds of the draft anywhere, so he might be a guy that we can get a little bit of value on as this draft moves along. So it looks like we've got some interesting decisions ahead of us in the draft, as I noted when we think about what's going to happen in the next episode. We will have 3 of the next 8 picks. We are on the board right now, so we've got our choice of anybody that we've talked about or anybody else available in the draft, and odds are that most of the players that we have talked about will still be available in a few picks when we go back to back at the end of the supplemental round 1 here in 2041. So things are still going well for our Oakland A's here in 2041 with that 53-34 record. If you've got thoughts on what you would do in the draft, would love to hear them. Federico Arriola continues to have an outstanding season for us, leading the American League with 12 wins, second in the league with a 2.28 ERA, as he and every other pitcher in the American League tries to stop Steve Jenis's 7 consecutive American League Cy Young Award streak here in 2041. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.